Harry says, you don't like me anymore, why not? And he says, because you got so terribly pretentious. And Harry says, pretentious? Muah.
Hey, how's it? This is Dan, and from 2002 to 2006, I attended University of the Arts in Philadelphia for my undergraduate degree in writing for film and television, which is another way of saying screenwriting. I also minored in narrative video production, which is another way of saying, filmmaking. And during my time there was also, I think, I would say the peak of Charlie Kaufman's career. Charlie Kaufman being the screenwriter originally of things like Adaptation, Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, or some of his bigger ones. But he's done a slew of kind of indie darling films, and one came out recently on Netflix in the past couple years called I'm Thinking of Ending Things. I didn't see his last film, the stop motion one, because I just haven't been able to get my hands on it yet, but I'm really curious to see it. The thing about Charlie Kaufman is that when I was in screenwriting school, he was like our hero. He was the screenwriting god. He could do no wrong. And then later he went on to direct films. I think his first film was Synecdoche, New York. I hope I pronounced that right. But aside from all of his street cred with writing these amazing screenplays back in the day, the fact that he had a scene with Robert McKee, with Brian Cox playing Robert McKee, the screenwriting guru of the time who had written Story, which was at the time, and this was 20 years ago now, he was the main go-to book and textbook that we would refer back to in school. To see that reference on the big screen and to be in school at the same time, reading that guy's book, it was just all mind-blowing. It was so validating for a wannabe screenwriter, and he was a really big name back then. So I, was a loyal fan of his until I saw Synecdoche, New York, and I just really, really didn't like it. It didn't sit with me well. I think I want to say I understood what it was going for, but the lack of narrative tension that I felt watching it, and the lack of character development, just some of the basic stuff that I understood that Charlie Kaufman is kind of one of those people that likes to subvert the rules, and he created a whole character in Adaptation just as a way to explore his feelings and musings on what it means to be kind of a rote rule follower and not have integrity, but just do it for the paycheck and that kind of thing. I just felt like he went so far off of what speaks to me as a cinema lover, as a story lover. With that film, I was so bored and detached that it was such a slog to get through for me. But there was a big gap then after that. I guess I'm assuming that movie didn't do very well, or his career changed path. I didn't really follow him as closely after that, if his name came up. When I heard that he had made a stop motion film, Anomalisa, I think it's called. I was definitely interested, but again, my experience with his previous film, especially the fact that he both wrote and directed it, it just gave me pause and didn't make me want to run out and try to find it. So if I ever come across it, if it's streaming on something that I already have a subscription to, I will definitely check it out and hopefully go in with an open mind is my intention. But that opportunity did come up with his next movie, I'm Thinking of Ending Things, and I had no idea that he was working on a new project. It just came up on my Netflix suggestions at one point. Pretty sure this was during the pandemic lockdown era. I was looking for something new to watch anyway, and it came up and the imagery and everything looked interesting, but then when I saw the trailer and it said, by the person that brought you Eternal Sunshine and Adaptation, or whatever it said exactly, mentioned Charlie Kaufman, I was like, oh, it's a Charlie Kaufman film, and it's written directed by him again, and it's on streaming. This is interesting. I wonder if he has changed and evolved, or what his intentions are for getting back into the game at this point, because it's been a really big gap in between most of his projects, but especially since everything that he's done since I graduated from college back in the mid 2000s. So this isn't really going to be a review or anything like that. Just seeing this film got me thinking about the whole idea of more abstract, off the beaten path, subversive expectations, avant-garde, non-linear, non-traditional, structured, however you want to say it. But I just mean films that don't follow the standard. And it got me thinking about that because watching that movie, I had unfortunately, the same exact experience that I had with Synecdoche, New York, where I was bored out of my mind. I wasn't engaged with anything going on. I understood that there was a lot going on, but I just didn't care. And, I went to YouTube after and I watched several people's interpretations and all those like ending explain videos and stuff, or the analysis videos that people do. And I'm really glad that that stuff is out there, because it does help me digest and process things that I find particularly hard to do just on my own. I love getting other people's thoughts and opinions on their interpretations of film and art. It's one reason I do this. I really have never intended this thing that I do, whether it's podcasts or videos or anything, to be just an echo chamber of me spitting out opinions. It's more of a, hey, this is what I think about stuff, but I'm curious what other people think. And I love when I get feedback that is in like total contradiction to what I felt. But if it's something I hadn't thought of, or in a way I'd thought of it, I love to integrate that into how I felt. Maybe my, emotional reaction to it is the same, but I have a deeper appreciation for it, or I'll go back and be able to see it again with whole new eyes and an open heart. But the more I thought about, I'm thinking of ending things and then relating it back to his earlier work and how much his earlier work meant to me. Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind is one of my top favorite movies of all time. I actually discussed that on a much earlier episode that I did with my brother about our favorite films. And that is a somewhat non-linear, non-traditionally told story. But it is the kind of story that when you break it down and you rearrange the pieces, kind of like a Tarantino movie, it's all there in terms of, traditional storytelling elements. It's just presented in a, kind of unique way. And before I go any further, I definitely should make the disclaimer that just in terms of my own preferences, I tend to gravitate more towards mainstream, traditional storytelling kind of tropes and presentations. I love a good tight 3-act structure. That's one reason even as an adult I can appreciate, Disney films that are intended more for families, or Pixar, because I like a good tightly told, well-crafted, tense story with stakes, with relatable characters, kind of like the way that I consume music as well. I can appreciate the intentions behind avant-garde and prog music and things that really aren't meant to be consumed in a normal way or by the mainstream. But when it really comes down to it, like what I'm looking for in terms of like stories and art and expression is relatability, being able to like kind of process and relate my own experiences and feel something tangible from the consumption of that stuff. I guess just for a person like me, I don't get that kind of response when something is meant to be either like challenging or disconcerting or confusing, convoluted, what have you. So I understand the difference between the two. I understand ways of doing things and why you would want to do one over the other or vice versa, but it doesn't mean that I have to like it. And I think that's a thing that is troublesome in terms of like conversation, especially, on the internet these days, is it can be hard to hear that people don't like things that you like and hear their perspective on their criticism and critiques around that stuff. Most of the time it's harmless and it's just an opinion. It's not meant to be hurtful or hateful or completely rejecting the thing that they're critiquing. But, art is subjective and everybody's going to have their own unique response to it. The sum of our experiences that makes up our perspectives, there's so many factors involved that cannot equate to somebody else's exactly. So there's nothing wrong with having a difference of not only of opinion, but also of experience. Even just the fact that like how you feel in any given moment might differ from how you feel in another moment. And, you can listen or watch or experience the same thing, but in different moments or at different times, and you're going to have a different response to it. So all that's just to say that I totally understand and respect the artistry and the craftsmanship and the passion and the intention behind things that are harder to wrap my head around when it comes to art. An argument that I hear, or a defense that I hear thrown out a lot when people criticize things that they don't like, is that people don't get it. And I don't think that that is usually the case. At least maybe they don't get or don't care to get exactly what they were going for, or what the vision or the message really is. But what people usually don't get when people say they don't get it is they're not getting the same experience as you. They're not feeling the same things that you are feeling from it. They're not reacting the same way. It doesn't mean they don't intellectually understand or maybe even subconsciously understand what was being presented or why. It just means they didn't like it. Not liking something is not a judgment on quality necessarily, just a personal preference. So I'm saying all that because I'm going to put myself on the line here. And like I've already alluded to, the fact that most avant-garde-ish kind of filmmaking, I just don't really connect with it. So when I first saw I'm Thinking of Ending Things, that was kind of my initial reaction, was like, all right, this wasn't meant for me. Yes, I'm a fan of Charlie Kaufman and his work in general, and I can appreciate everything that went into that. But I was also really frustrated with the film because I felt like it was being intentionally confusing and convoluted. And, yes, there were a lot of different clues visually and auditorily given for me to piece things together if I really took, the time and effort to really dissect it and think about it. But when I watch a film, I go in for a kind of like raw, real experience. I walk away from it like, how did I feel about that? And in this film, even though there was some interesting stuff going on, like I've already said, I just didn't care. I wasn't engaged. I wasn't into it. It felt like I was watching somebody's pretentious art project that they think is so cool and interesting because of all the different ways that they came up with to present it. And, like, isn't this so cool that I did this and I did that? But as an audience member, when you put stuff out there for people to consume, my reaction was just one of like detachment and boredom. But it got me thinking, like, do I really just not get it? Am I just not meant for offbeat kind of stuff? And then it occurred to me that there were a few films that I have seen in the past few years that I really, really loved and that had a kind of profound and lasting effect on me beyond what I expected, is even during watching it, that I think kind of fit into this category of offbeat, avant-garde, abstract-ish kind of storytelling. And these are all, like I'm Thinking of Ending Things, they're all mid-budget movies with either some newer or some really tried and true and respected people involved in them. And for each of these that I'm going to list, I definitely didn't get everything on first viewing, and I'm sure that there's stuff that I'll pick up on, on subsequent viewings, and it'll continue like that, and I'll have different reactions to it. But even though there were things that were confusing, there were things that were left open-ended or ambiguous, sometimes purposely so, of course. What it came down to, I think the reason that I loved these movies as is, even if I never fully understand or meant to understood the complete story and why everything happened the way it did, my kind of guttural, real, raw experience watching each one of these, even though it was a different reaction to a certain degree, was I enjoyed it. It was fun and engaging and scary and horrifying, thrilling, all those kind of things. And these are all very different movies. And I've heard that there is a lot of criticism about them, similar to the kind of criticisms that I have for Charlie Kaufman's later work, where people just felt like it was intentionally confusing and convoluted, or, more ambiguous than it needed to be, or that the filmmakers really didn't even know what they were doing, all that kind of stuff. I guess the general reaction to all of these movies from critics and audiences alike, where people were frustrated because it didn't give them everything. It didn't spoon feed them everything. And I guess maybe because of like the marketing or the directors or whatever it was, some audiences went into these movies thinking that it was going to be something that it really wasn't ever meant to be. But of all the things that these movies were, or people think they are, to me, the one thing that they aren't is, in my opinion, pretentious. And that's for one simple reason. Like I said, I enjoyed the experience of watching them. First one being Mother. By Darren Aronofsky. And I've liked his stuff over the years. I haven't seen all of his movies. What I have seen, I've generally really liked, but some of his earlier stuff is just so disturbing, I haven't been able to revisit it at all. And that was a criticism that I heard about Mother as well. And I totally get why people were turned off by this film, in the same way that like Passion of the Christ was really challenging for a lot of people, just that it's so brutal and it's about such a touchy subject that people, have a lot of stake in that subject matter, and it can be really uncomfortable to watch. But that film, as I was watching it and as it kind of built on itself, and I mean, it was so metaphoric and symbolic and allegorical, and there were so many different ways to interpret and read into it, that I can see why people were really frustrated with it, because it really didn't give you anything, like any answers, any tangibleness. Like, it was just all very haughty and heady. But there was something about it, and it was related to the presentation, not just what was going on, but the way that it was structured centered. I thought it was a thrilling, enthralling experience. I totally get why people didn't like it, but I not only found the subject matter to be really interesting and, the way that it was presented and the different ways that you could interpret it, but the claustrophobia and Jennifer Lawrence's raw and passionate reactions to the things that were happening, I found really engaging. And, I had a lot of like sympathy and empathy for her and how frustrating it was, like the things that she needed and the things that needed to happen weren't happening and were like things were happening in direct contradiction to what she needed. It was difficult, but I think one thing about it that really helped me appreciate it a lot more and is going to make it more rewatchable for me over time as compared to some of his earlier work about like addiction or mental health and things like that is it dealt with really heavy subject matter, but it was also so detached from reality, our reality, that it was kind of like going with the flow of the feelings and emotions, and everything that was coming at you was just kind of like more experiential than it was intellectual, and then it was like relatable, but I still related to how I felt about it and what the characters were feeling. So it was just one example to me of you can do something that is really kind of like out there in terms of how you present your story to an audience, but it doesn't have to be completely aloof and unengaging. Another couple were more in like the indie horror realm. I had heard for a while about It Comes at Night before it came out, and I'd heard a lot of controversy about it. So I watched it just because I was kind of catching up with a lot of like indie horror that was making waves around that time, like The Witch. And this was part of that conversation of like, what's the word that is happening right now that's controversial? Elevated horror, whatever that means. But again, watching that film was so enthralling to me. It was simultaneously really kind of slow, and there wasn't like a lot of, I don't want to say action, but I just mean like things happening, but there was such tangible tension and anxiety, and there was always just something just out of frame. You could feel like there was just something scratching at the door, like not specifically, not physically, but I mean, just in terms of like the edge of the seat kind of nature of it. And this one was a more linearly told story, but the ambiguity about it, the way that they used the tropes of like, somebody having some horrible experience and then waking up from a bad dream, but then realizing later that probably wasn't a dream. I love how they played around with those tropes and the jump scares, the wandering around at night kind of stuff. Usually that stuff really bugs me in films like this because it's so obviously substanceless that it just feels like, very surface and one note. But it felt like everything in this film was intentional and layered. Like the director, I'm pretty sure, said at an interview at some point, everything is there. All the clues are there. All the information is there that you need to put the pieces together. It just isn't spoon-fed to you. And I love that. I'm so glad that unlike Us, for instance, by Jordan Peele, I loved Us, all of it, until like the last minute where they felt the need to explain everything. It would have been so much better to me to be left open-ended and ambiguous and fill in the blanks yourself, because there were more than enough clues and pieces laid out for us to understand or to interpret, come to our own conclusions about what was going on. Once they explain what was going on with all of the, what were they, like the clones or the others, the other us's. Is that a Bill and Ted thing?
How would you like to come to Earth with us and help us build good robot us's to save two beautiful princesses from bad robot us's?
Once they explain all that, it just left more questions than answers. It wasn't necessary. As opposed to It Comes at Night, where I felt so respected as an audience member, which is ironic because I think a lot of times, and like what I was kind of reacting to with I'm thinking of ending things was I don't want to say I felt disrespected, but I didn't feel like Charlie Kaufman and I were on the same page. It just felt more of like, hey, isn't this cool what I can do? As opposed to, here's something I think you would like too. I think that was kind of the difference. And that's where like It Comes at Night was a perfect balance of those things, where it was very atypical, but intense, engaging, and I was floored by it. And very similarly, I can't talk today. A similar experience that I had in a similar indie genre of horror, thriller, whatever you want to call it, is The Empty Man. I never would have heard of this movie or at least I wouldn't have come up on my radar had Chris Stuckman, the movie reviewer on YouTube, who's about to make his first indie horror film that was the highest backed Kickstarter horror project ever on Kickstarter. Kudos to Chris, and I'm really excited to see his movie, and I hope to talk about it, especially positively, fingers crossed. But he recommended The Empty Man. I usually trust and align with Chris's general sentiments about film. I assumed I would like it, but it was really different than what I expected. Not that I really expected anything in particular, but just like It Comes at Night, I think a reason that I liked it so much was because, again, it used tropes in the genre that it was telling a story through and subverted them, but not in obnoxious like Rian Johnson kind of ways. They didn't feel like spiteful or aloof or even kind of mean-spirited subversions. It felt like they understood their genre so well that they knew how to toy with it and toy with audience expectations. It was such a strange movie. I mean, like the epilogue of the movie was like maybe a quarter or a fifth of the runtime of the film. I've never seen anything like that before. And then it changed gears completely into something else, and you see how it all kind of comes back together. But just like It Comes at Night, it wasn't all explained and laid out for you. It was definitely left kind of open-ended and ambiguous and interpretive. But the experience of watching it still, I found to be really interested. I was engaged the whole time. I was curious and I was confused, like in that fun way where I'm like, what is going on? I gotta keep watching to know, you know? I just thought it was a great movie and a great film-going experience. I wish I had got to see it in the theater on the big screen. And it's such a shame. I think It Comes at Night did okay, but it's a shame to me that Mother and The Empty Man were pretty much flops because, especially now, we're in this weird time where it's getting harder and harder, especially at the mainstream level. I think a lot of times we tend to equate big studio films and big budgeted films with things that are able to get a big budget for production. But the other side of it too is, you know, the marketing and the distribution. And I think even more so, at least from how it appears right now, instead of studios to take risks, not just on giving films a big budget for production, a lot of times they don't seem like they know what to do with a lot of these films in a marketing and distribution sense. That's why we're seeing a lot of this stuff dumped onto streaming. I'm thinking of Ending Things as a good example of that. I don't know the story behind it, but I don't know if it got a theatrical release. I doubt it did because it was a Netflix film, a Netflix produced film, or at least had Netflix's name on it. But what that says to me, and, you know, the relative box office failure of some of these other movies that studios did take a risk on, like Mother, which had a big name attached to it, or The Empty Man, which I think was like a first or early in his career director and writer. But they did take risks on those and they didn't pay off. And I don't think that that is the film's fault itself. I think that there are audiences for this kind of stuff, however abstract and harder to grasp it may be by general audiences. And I mean, I think that's great that streaming is out there and is kind of like the savior of a lot of this like lower to mid budget genre kind of filmmaking that studios are really scared to make now because they know it's not going to give them the $1 billion return that they want on their investments. But I also think that if these studios really took the time and effort to understand their different audiences and the demographics and like what they really want out of a film going experience, that they could find audiences for this stuff. It's not going to give them necessarily the huge returns that they want, but I don't think that Mother or The Empty Man necessarily would have flopped if the marketing and distribution side of things were taken into as much consideration as just the production budget side. I know this is getting a little bit into the weeds of everything, but it's just a shame to me to see such great stuff happening. You know, a lot of people, I guess, in a more general sense, talk about film being homogenized around, you know, kind of like the Disney Marvel model and stuff like that. And that's definitely true. But all this weird, wacky stuff that's coming out on streaming services, especially, and like A24, and, you know, there's, of course, a lot of like foreign markets that are a lot more supportive of this stuff. But it shows that there are audiences out there for things. And I think people would go to the theaters to see this kind of stuff, maybe smaller theaters in smaller numbers, but they're out there. Studios need to try to connect with those audiences in maybe more unconventional ways than just, you know, having like a Super Bowl commercial or a YouTube ad. But I really didn't mean to go off on a whole tangent there about that. I guess I'm just excited that I've discovered some movies, especially more recent ones, that kind of scratch that itch that I had ever since I was a kid, really. Because even though I gravitate mostly towards more conventional kind of storytelling and filmmaking, if I go into an action movie, there are certain things that I want out out of that action movie or horror movie or comedy or whatever. You can hear my musings on everything that I think is wrong with modern comedy on an earlier episode. I do have, and I always have had, a soft spot for more unconventional stuff, because even as a kid, probably maybe a little earlier than I was ready for to really understand, but I remember, especially when I would be homesick, maybe, with the flu or something, and I couldn't really get off the couch, my dad would get me a stuffed animal, and he would rent something kind of weird or offbeat from Blockbuster on VHS, because I'm that old. And I remember seeing things like Harold and Maude and The Graduate as a young kid, which, are still pretty conventionally told stories, but in terms of their market share of conventionalism, I'd say they're pretty far on the other side of being non-mainstream and offbeat. And that just kind of opened my eyes to the fact that there is a lot more out there and a lot more potentiality of stories and characters than the stuff that I was, ravenously passionate about, like Star Wars and Star Trek and Indiana Jones and Back to the Future and all that more conventional kind of stuff. And also, my parents loved Mel Brooks movies, so I saw like Young Frankenstein and Blazing Saddles and films like that too as a younger person. So thanks, Mom and Dad, if you're listening. I appreciate the exposure. So just to wrap this up, I think where I'm really coming from with all this, my overall point is that film and stories can be unconventional and avant-garde or abstract without being pretentious.
Pretentious? Muah?
I think that's just an opinion, though. I think everybody kind of has their own perspective on that and what pretentiousness looks like and what is enjoyable and what isn't. I'm sure some people went to see My Dinner with Andre and were just absolutely floored the whole time. I can tell you that having watched it in film school, I wasn't. But that doesn't mean that I reject everything just because it's not typical or if it doesn't meet my expectations, as long as, like with The Empty Man, for instance, as long as it has something compelling going on that I can follow to a degree and enjoy it while the experience is happening, not after the fact, not really dislike it or be completely detached and bored by it, but then watch a YouTube video explaining it to me where I'm like, oh, okay, I see what they were going for there. Like with I'm Thinking of Ending Things. It doesn't change the fact that the experience of watching it is what was really the deciding factor of whether or not I liked it. So I would love to hear your thoughts and reactions to this subject. What are some of your favorite offbeat, atypical movies or stories? Where do you think the line is drawn with being odd and offbeat in compelling and, engaging ways? And where does it just cross that line into just pretension and experimentation for experimentation's sake without any real intentionality or substance behind it to support it, to make it engaging and fun? So thanks for listening. Hit me up and I will see you on the next one. Be sure to visit breathingunderwater.us. Follow me on Instagram at breathingunderwater1 and on Twitter at breathingdakine. That's at breathingdakine. And drop me a line at breathingunderwater1@gmail.com. Please note that I do not claim any ownership of any media presented in this podcast, which is only used for promotional purposes unless otherwise noted. And all views and opinions are those of the person expressing them and do not represent any other entities discussed in this podcast.